Good evening. I'm Roger Mudd in Washington.
And I'm Robert MacNeil in New York. After tonight's news summary, we have a newsmaker interview with Secretary of State Warren Christopher. Then a discussion of possible factors in the suicide of White House aide Vincent Foster, depression, and the pressures of Washington.
New York Life is proud to provide funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. Yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. Funding has also been provided by PepsiCo. PepsiCo. And by the Archer Daniels Midland Company. ADM, supermarket to the world. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
President Clinton today nominated Army General John Shalikashvili to replace Colin Powell as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Powell will retire in September. Shalikashvili is currently the military commander of NATO forces. Following the Gulf War, he commanded Allied troops in their operation to secure a safe haven for the Kurds in northern Iraq. He was born in Poland of parents from the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. He emigrated to the United States as a youth with his family to Peoria, Illinois. He began his career as an Army draftee and worked his way up after attending officer candidate school. His troops call him General Shally, and that's what the president called him at the Rose Garden announcement.
General Shally is superbly well qualified for this position. He is a soldier's soldier, a proven warrior, a creative and flexible visionary who clearly understands the myriad of conflicts, ethnic, religious, and political, gripping the world, as well as the immense possibilities for the United States and for the cause of freedom that are out there before us. He has shown a proven ability to work with our allies in complex and challenging circumstances. He understands how to downsize the armed forces and still maintain the strongest military in the world with the equipment and, most important, the trained force with the morale we need to always fight and win when we have to.
By nominating General Shally, President Clinton bypassed all current members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Marine Corps will bar married recruits beginning in October 1995. A message released today by the Commandant, General Carl Munday, said troubled or failed marriages were taking a heavy toll on the Corps. He said single Marines will be required to take classes aimed at discouraging early marriage. The number of married recruits allowed to join will be reduced beginning this fall until it reaches zero in 1995. Robin?
President Clinton today unveiled his plans to fight crime in America. He issued 2 presidential directives to combat gun violence. One bans the importation of foreign-made assault pistols. The second tightens regulations on gun dealers. Mr. Clinton also previewed crime legislation he will send to Congress next month. It will include some $3.4 billion in spending to put an additional 50,000 police officers on the streets. And he'll propose tougher penalties for gun crime, expand the federal death penalty, and limit the appeals of death row inmates. Mr. Clinton spoke about the bill in a Rose Garden ceremony.
It will put police on the street and criminals in jail. It expands the federal death penalty. It lets criminals know that if they are guilty, they will be punished. It lets law-abiding citizens know that we are working to give them the safety they deserve. It is the beginning, just the beginning, but a major beginning of a long-term strategy to make America a more law-abiding, peaceful place, and to make Americans more secure, and to give our young people wherever they live a better chance to grow up, to learn, to function, to work, and to have a decent life.
The president also called on Congress to pass the Brady bill. It requires a 5-day waiting period and background checks for handgun purchases. A spokesman for the National Rifle Association said that group supports the call for immediate background checks, but not the 5-day waiting period.
A State Department spokesman said today the continued Bosnian Serb occupation of 2 mountainsides overlooking Sarajevo could trigger NATO airstrikes. Some Serb troops and equipment were seen coming down from the mountains, but UN officials said Serbs still held the peaks. There were also reports they were bringing in fresh troops and weapons. In Washington, State Department spokesman Mike McCurry was asked whether the Serb occupation was enough to meet the conditions set by NATO for launching the airstrikes in Bosnia.
It's the view of the United States that occupation of those 2 mountains is a critical element of the Serbs' ability to strangle Sarajevo. and that's the specific reference in the NATO document, and the strangulation of Sarajevo being one of those criteria that would then trigger a response by NATO itself.
A UN spokesman in Somalia said today that UN forces had killed 7 Somali gunmen. He said they were riding in a truck with a rocket launcher and had opened fire at 2 U.S. helicopters, and one of them returned the fire. There were at least 4 other clashes between UN troops and armed Somalis overnight. The UN spokesman said supporters of fugitive warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid appeared to have increased their attacks on coalition forces over the past week. 4 U.S. soldiers died Sunday when their vehicle was blown up in an explosion blamed on Aidid.
Agriculture Secretary Mike Espy said today that crop losses from the Midwest floods and East Coast drought will amount to $2.5 billion. Corn crops are 22% smaller than last year, soybean crops down 13%. But Espy said the losses had to be viewed in a national context.
The reduced corn and soybean production forecast will not leave, though, this country with dangerously low stocks. In fact, we have forecast about 2 billion bushels in corn stocks held over because of the large production in 1992. Feed grain stocks are ample. Moreover, higher corn and soybean prices will cause lower domestic use and exports, particularly for soybeans where supplies are tighter. As always, the complex economics of agriculture will create winners and losers, but it looks like consumers will not be affected, and if so, only slightly. The vagaries of nature are not going to result in a significantly higher food bill for consumers.
At another news conference, Secretary Espy announced new labeling requirements for all raw and partially cooked meats. The move is aimed at reducing the risk of food poisoning from bacteria like the E. coli bacteria, which caused illnesses and deaths earlier this year. The new labels will be required as of October 15th. They recommend refrigerating or freezing meats, washing work surfaces, utensils, and hands after touching raw meat, cooking thoroughly, and refrigerating leftovers.
Pope John Paul II arrived in the Mexican city of Merida today. It was his first visit to the country since Mexico reestablished diplomatic ties with the Vatican last year after 130 years. He was met at the city's airport by President Carlos Salinas and a crowd of supporters. About 1.5 million people are expected to turn out for the Pope's 24-hour visit to the Yucatan Peninsula. He leaves tomorrow for Denver, Colorado, where he will address a World Youth Conference and meet with President Clinton.
That's our summary of the top stories in the news. Now it's on to Secretary of State Warren Christopher and the suicide of Vincent Foster.
First tonight, a newsmaker interview with Secretary of State Warren Christopher. He's just back from the Middle East and a stop in Europe to review NATO plans for airstrikes in Bosnia, and he's come back to find Somalia also on his diplomatic platter. Good evening, Mr. Secretary.
Good evening, Roger.
You heard the announcement of General Shalley to be the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What do you know about him?
Well, I'm delighted. Actually, I talked to him last Friday afternoon in Aviano. He was there to give me a briefing on the possible plans for airstrikes against Bosnia. He's deeply into that problem, and I think he's an excellent choice. He's just the right man for the kind of problems we face today. So I think the President made a fine choice, and I'll look forward to working with him.
Why is he the right man?
Well, he's had a good deal of experience with the kind of problems we're likely to face. Peacekeeping problems, problems of ethnicity. He really brings to it a wide experience. For example, the way he dealt with the problems of the Kurds in Iraq is a good sign for his ability to deal with the very complex problems we have to deal in this post-Cold War period.
I'm sure you know already that your spokesman, Mr. McCurry, said that you heard him on our broadcast saying that continued occupation of the 2 mountains overlooking Sarajevo would in fact trigger airstrikes. Does that mean there's now a deadline for their evacuation?
Well, those 2 mountains are very important to the survival of Sarajevo. The real test is whether or not Sarajevo is going to be strangled by the Serbs. They've been in this process of strangulation, and these 2 mountains give them a very key fix on Sarajevo. So I think it was quite understandable that President Izetbegovic said that he would not go back to the negotiating table until these mountains were vacated by the Serbs. I think that'll be a good test as to whether or not the Serbs are serious take us seriously that they're going to have to stop the strangulation of Sarajevo. Now, it's a broader situation. Just vacating those two mountains will not by itself nearly be enough. The question is, can the humanitarian aid get through? Will they cease trying to strangle Sarajevo? So we'll be looking at the whole situation.
But is there a deadline?
Well, the negotiators and President Izetbegovic said that unless they left by tomorrow morning, the negotiations would not begin. And we've not given them a particular deadline for getting off the mountains, but I must say, Roger, I've asked to have daily and sometimes hourly reports on the situation there as to whether or not the siege of Sarajevo is being broken by the Serbs drawing back, and we'll be watching that very carefully, be reporting to our allies on what our intelligence is. As I say, I don't want to fix a precise time deadline, but it's the kind of situation where that's a very significant event to us as to whether they give up those mountaintops which have such a commanding position with respect to Sarajevo.
But it just seems forever that you've been playing cat and mouse with the Bosnian Serbs, doesn't it?
Well, we certainly have watched their technique. I think we've learned something from it. They're very manipulative, and we're not going to be manipulated in the future. We're going to really hold them to a very high standard. You probably heard the question and answer with General Shalikashvili. He indicated it's really up to the Serbs as to whether or not NATO is going to have to take some action. We prefer not, but we're certainly ready to do so unless they give us a better condition in Sarajevo than exists at the present time.
How far would they have to pull back off those mountainsides?
Well, they have to come down off the mountains, but most of all, I want to give you the real test, and that is whether or not they will break the siege of Sarajevo, that they will let conditions improve within that city so the city is not under the constant threat of being strangled. Those two mountain tops are only symbols of the strangulation of Sarajevo by the Serbs.
I have read and reread as many times as I've had the time to the conditions on the NATO airstrikes. And as I read it, NATO would set the target and the mission. Then the UN commander on the ground would approve the targets. Then the NATO Council would check with all the 16 allies, and they'd have to sign off. And then Boutros Ghali at the UN would presumably take it to the Security Council, and after they approved, then he would check off. If I may say so, that sounds like a goofy policy.
I don't think it's a goofy policy at all. Let me put this in a little context for you, Roger. Look what's happened over the last 2 weeks. It was only about 2 weeks ago that President wrote our 16 NATO allies, and I followed up with a much longer memorandum laying out what our new policy would be. Within that 2-week period, we've had 2 meetings of the NATO Council. Both of them took unanimous decisions. First, the policy decision that we would go forward with these airstrikes if necessary in order to break the siege of Sarajevo and improve humanitarian conditions. Then last Monday, we approved a military plan. Now, that military plan does provide for coalition action, but you wouldn't expect in this situation where NATO has had troops on the ground for about 2 years, has 20,000 troops, that we would proceed without the coordination with NATO. Let me tell you, Roger, when I was in Aviano last Friday, I saw the teamwork between NATO and the United Nations. And I don't have any question in my mind that we'll work very effectively. What the Secretary General has is so-called icebreaker. He has to authorize the first strikes, but from then on, it's a military operation. So I think this is only a recognition of the fact that the United Nations has been there for a couple of years with 20,000 troops. When NATO comes in, we must be fully coordinated. But one of the reasons I wanted to stop by Aviano last Friday night was to see this coordination, and I was immensely impressed with the coordination being brought by General Shalikashvili and Admiral Borda, who will be our 2 commanders on the ground.
Aviano is the U.S. air base near Venice in Italy, is
That's
that correct?
Correct.
But if the Bosnian Serbs read the instructions the same way I read them, they wouldn't be so frightened of an instant airstrike coming down. I mean, they would have a lot of play, wouldn't they?
Well, I think this might move more rapidly than they think because, there's a lot of the pre-planning done on this. The NATO commander, Admiral Borda, and the UN commander, General Kott, have been in almost daily contact on this. They're in each other's staff meetings. They're working very closely together. So I think if the time comes, if the decision is taken that the Serbs are strangling Sarajevo and interfering with humanitarian action, I think the action will go fairly quickly. Now, the political decision is one that will be reached in the NATO Council. And of course, I think that's a very important decision and ought to be debated in the NATO Council. After all, this is coalition building. Coalition building in this period of time is very important. We're going to have to act this way in the future. Sometimes we'll act alone, but in many instances, as in this one, we need to work with our allies in coalition building.
You once said recently that the United States is doing all it can in Bosnia consistent with our national interest.
Yes.
That's still your position?
Well, I said at that same press conference that we hadn't abandoned Bosnia, that we're going to continue to do all we can. And I'm glad to have an opportunity to say now that in this context, once again, we think that this is the right course for the United States. We think this is the right action for us to take. This is doing what we can at the present time to try to resolve this problem. Now, we're not going to, we don't intend to, the President has made a decision not to put 200,000 or 300,000 ground troops, but we've reached the point where it's necessary to give a warning and be prepared to use military force, to use air power, to carry out United States policy in this situation. So I think we'll continue to do all we can in the national interest, but we've concluded that it is in our national interest to prevent the strangulation of Sarajevo in conjunction with our allies.
I meant to ask you, as an adjunct to your previous question, if the decision is made to launch an airstrike, give me an estimate of how long it would take before something would fall out of a plane. Would it be 2 days or 18 hours, or could it be done in the morning?
Well, that's going to be a military decision, and I wouldn't want to give you an exact timeline on it. But let me say the military planning is very thorough and very complete. And if there is finally a political decision, that is, if all the NATO allies are in support, if the Secretary General of the United Nations gives his approval, and I think there'll be lots of people talking with him about that approval, then I think the military action will be taken very promptly and very seasonably. I think it would be unwise of me to give an exact timeline, but when I was there in Aviano, our air base, as you said, in Italy, I got the impression that our military people are prepared to move very quickly when they get the order.
Does the United States, Mr. Secretary, still embrace the Owen peace plan, which envisions the partition of Bosnia?
The United States wants to have a single state remain, a viable single state of Bosnia. Now, it's really up to the parties as to the nature of that state, whether it's a confederation of three states with some ethnic character. That really is up to the parties, but the United States is quite determined that there shall remain a single state, a viable state that will have an entity about it for the future. Beyond that, as I say, we're going to be encouraging the parties to negotiate. We're going to be expressing the view that it's very important that the Muslim portion of that area be viable, that is, it can exist in the future, but it is really up to the parties to determine the exact shape and configuration.
But in the United States view, that Bosnian entity need not coincide exactly. I want to stop because your microphone has fallen off, and I hope the audience has been able to hear some very interesting answers. In the United States view, the present state of Bosnia's borders need not conform precisely with the future Bosnia?
Well, I would think the overall configuration would be the same, but within the overall configuration of the state of Bosnia, whether there is some division on an ethnic basis within the overall state of Bosnia is really up to the parties. That is, whether there are confederal states within the overall state of Bosnia is up to the parties to determine, and what the shape of those various entities within the state are. But we remain determined that there be an overall state of Bosnia, and as I say, we think that each of the portions should be viable.
Is it difficult for you as the Secretary of State of a democratic country to put a blessing on the creation of a country that is divided by ethnic class?
Yes, it certainly is. The concept, though, of a multi-ethnic state where there is complete free flow of the individuals back and forth is one that apparently the parties there are not able to abide. We can't, from this distance, make these parties get along or like each other. You know, you take Hawaii now. They have different ethnicities there, the Chinese, the Caucasians, the Hawaiians, who really apparently want to live together. And so they worked it out in a very healthy and democratic way. In Bosnia, there's such ancient hatreds that evidently the ethnic groups want to try to divide it and be in separate enclaves. That'll be a decision that they will have to make, and it's very hard to dictate that from a distance.
Is it fair to raise the question, what's the difference between the partitioning of Bosnia in 1994 or 5 and the partitioning of Czechoslovakia in 1938?
Well, the partitioning here will be, if there is a partition, it'll be states within an overall state. It'll be federal enclaves or confederal enclaves within an overall state of Bosnia. Now, just how many powers are retained for the federal government is something that'll be the subject of negotiation here. But you know, there is certainly the concept in international law of a confederation, that is, enclaves that are joined together with certain powers reserved for the central government and other powers reserved for the local government. So in that respect, it's considerably different than the Czechoslovakia.
Let me try Somalia.
Yes.
Tuesday's headline says, exit plan for Somalia stepped up. Wednesday's headline said, U.S. troops to remain in Somalia. Which is it?
Well, the second headline is...
Second headline. First headline came out of the Pentagon and the second out of the State Department.
Well, you know, it's the president's decision, and the president feels that we must keep our troops there. We began in Somalia as a humanitarian endeavor, and it was extremely successful. The people are fed there. Indeed, they're so well fed that at the present time, the feeding operation will soon be suspended. We have taken great steps, made great strides, especially outside the city of Mogadishu. Now we're in the process of, under United Nations auspices, working toward nation building, working toward trying to create a structure for the future of that country. And the United States troops will remain there to assist under United Nations auspices in this nation building, to trying to restructure a country that was, when we came there, really in chaos without any governmental structure. So I think it's important for the public to see it in two pieces. First, the humanitarian piece, the feeding piece, which was done so successfully under primarily United States auspices. Now we're moving to a second phase under United Nations auspices of trying to provide some nation building, give some structure to that country so it can move forward to resolve its own problems in the future. And for that latter point, there is not a United States exit. There's a United States intention to stay and help.
Ambassador Shin said yesterday that the goal remained U.S. troops out by 94. Was that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate.
That's the goal.
Yes, that's the goal.
But not the guarantee, of course.
No, there's no guarantee. But of course, our troops have been drawn down from 22,000 to 4,000 or 5,000 at the present time, and there'll be future drawdowns. But we want to do our part. We want to see that country get back on its feet.
Do you, Mr. Secretary, regard the warlord
Mohammed Adid?
Adid, I'm sorry, I had a brain freeze. Adid as the main obstacle to stability in Somalia?
I didn't think that happened to anchors. It happens on this side many times.
I'll tell you lots after I get off the air.
Well, he certainly is the principal obstacle at the present time. I think something has to be done to bring him under control so we can get on, so the Somalians can get on with nation building. He seems to be the principal obstacle, he and his followers, and I think if we can somehow rein him in, that his followers will not be nearly as big a problem, and that the problems of the country will be much simplified. As just to emphasize what I said before, in much of the country, great strides have been made, even on the nation building, the difficult problem of nation building. The problem is mainly now in South Mogadishu, right. And I think if we can do something about Adid, that problem would be greatly eased.
Why is he so hard to find and arrest? We got 22,000 troops in there.
Well, you know, that's a country that's a long ways from here. It's a very big city. He has a great many supporters. And it's not really very easy terrain for Americans or foreigners to penetrate. His supporters tend to protect him, tend to help hide him. I think we're going to have to find some new techniques to track him down and to at least diminish his power in some way. I'm not surprised that in a foreign city, somebody with considerable support from the population of that city is able to be a very hard man to chase.
Now, the Middle East, Mr. Secretary, how much credit should you get for getting the Mideast peace talks back on track, and how much should be given to Israel and Syria for wanting to talk anyway?
Well, I don't think the real question is where credit is entitled to be taken. I think the important thing is that the peace talks are back on track, and perhaps most important of all, that very dangerous situation has been diffused. I was out in Singapore when I began to get reports that fighting was going on between the Israelis and between the Hezbollah in South Lebanon, that they were launching rockets against northern Israel, and then Israel was basically launching an effort there. That seemed to me to be a very dangerous situation, so I hurried back here and began to try to help facilitate a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities between the parties. Fortunately, that was done over a 2 or 3 day period. The parties pulled back from this, and understandings were reached that that fighting would stop. And then the question was, could we restore the peace process? Because naturally that fighting had caused some ill feelings on both sides, and so I decided to make a trip to the region that I had planned before to go out and see if we could salvage the peace talks and get them back on track. I think that's been done. One of the gratifying things I found out there, Roger, is that despite the bad feelings caused by that episode, to a person, people thought they had to get on with the peace process. Indeed, that episode had only underscored the need to try to get underlying problems, to deal with the underlying problems. So the question is not who gets credit for what went on out there or who solved the problem. The real question is that the peace process is more or less back on track now, and we ought to all work hard. President Clinton's desire to be a full partner here is crucial, and I want to do what I can to play that role of assisting the parties as an intermediary.
Do you think Israeli Prime Minister Rabin overreacted in response to the Hezbollah attack? I mean, that was a major excavation of people out of South Lebanon.
Part of my problem here really is not to be judgmental between the parties, but to try to help them reach conclusions. There was lots of provocation. If you were Prime Minister Rabin and they started launching rockets into your country, you would think you needed to take some fairly strong action too. So it's not my role to try to judge the reaction that was taken. It was my job to try to see if we couldn't help defuse the situation. It's been diffused. I think the parties are now determined to carry out the understandings that were reached, and also to get back to the peace table. And I think they're going to do that.
Do you see at the end of the Middle East tunnel even the dimmest light?
Yes, I see a dim light. It's way out there, and I think we ought to pursue it very hard.
My final question, unless Madison or Jefferson were joggers, you are the only jogging Secretary of State in the history of the Republic.
Well, I don't know whether that's true, but I find it very important, especially when you're working hard, to get some exercise every day, and I try to do that.
And you told the New York Times back in May that you were having the time of your life. Given all these problems that you have to carry around with you, is that still true?
Yes, I really am having a tremendous, challenging time, and I'm enjoying it all. It's not easy, and the problems go with the territory. But it's one of those, if life is about challenges, there are plenty of them here in the field of foreign policy.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Roger.
Robin?
Next, the very public death of a private man, and what, if anything, it says about working and living in the public spotlight of the nation's capital. Yesterday, the Justice Department closed their investigation into the death of Deputy White House Counsel Vincent Foster. The authorities concluded that Foster was deeply depressed and had committed suicide just 6 months after coming to Washington to serve in the administration of his best friend from kindergarten. Central to the case was a note Foster had written prior to his death. The note was said to have been found in the bottom of his briefcase, torn into 27 pieces. In it, Foster wrote, "I made mistakes from ignorance, inexperience, and overwork. I did not knowingly violate any law or standard of conduct. No one in the White House, to my knowledge, violated any law or standard of conduct, including any action in the travel office. There was no intent to benefit any individual or specific group. The FBI lied in their report to the AG, Attorney General Janet Reno. The press is covering up the illegal benefits they receive from the travel staff. The GOP has lied and misrepresented its knowledge and role and covered up a prior investigation. The usher's office plotted to have excessive costs incurred, taking advantage of Cocky and HRC, that is Little Rock interior designer Cocky Hookersmith and Hillary Rodham Clinton. The public will never believe the innocence of the Clintons and their loyal staff. The WSJ, Wall Street Journal, editors lie without consequence. I was not meant for the job or the spotlight of public life in Washington. Here, ruining people is considered sport. 4 different perspectives now. Marlin Fitzwater was White House press secretary during the Reagan and Bush administrations. He's now co-director of a public relations and political consulting firm in Washington. Clifford Alexander was an aide to both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson and Secretary of the Army during the Carter years. R.W. Apple is the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times. Dr. Frederick Goodwin is the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. He is the co-author of Manic Depressive Illness. Johnny Apple, Foster's note suggests that the Washington culture was too much for him. Many commentators, including an essayist on this program last night, are suggesting it has become uniquely tough and sadistic. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think it's tough, but I don't think it's uniquely tough, and I certainly don't think it's sadistic. Let's talk about places and jobs that are tough. The presidents of General Motors and Kodak and IBM have both been attacked for weeks and months on end in recent years and have been forced out of their jobs. What about people who do heart surgery or brain surgery? What about people who move millions and billions of dollars around in Wall Street? What about, for that matter, people who are trying to grow up in the ghettos of big cities and avoid being shot or becoming addicted? It does not seem to me, first, that working and living in Washington is that tough. It certainly does not seem to me that it is notably tougher than it was in the Johnson era or the Nixon era. This is not the first suicide we've had by a high government official. Mr. Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense, committed suicide. Several high-ranking officials of the CIA committed suicide some years ago. And I didn't hear it suggested then that this was because it was too tough in Washington. I think, although I'm no psychiatrist and no psychologist, it seems to me that people who commit suicide do so because of a flaw or an illness in their makeup, and not because the pressure is great.
Marlin Fitzwater, is it uniquely tough in Washington?
Well, I think, first of all, that every man makes his own pressure, and people are going to feel that pressure whatever their circumstances, and that may or may not make them susceptible to suicide. But I do think Washington is unique in this sense, that our democratic institutions are adversarial. The press against the government, Republicans against Democrats, constituencies against another. And so the processes of government, which have been the same for 200 years, do pit organizations and people against each other. And if you take those things personally, if you can't let them roll off your back, it can be a very difficult circumstance to work in.
What's your view of the culture in Washington, Clifford Alexander?
I would say that the culture in Washington has changed so dramatically in the last decade. We are more superficial as a culture. We are more personal as a culture. We tend to judge people according to the number of hours they work rather than the substance of their work. We also, unhappily, are very personal in our judgments of people and far less concerned with the substance of affairs. What one sees on the style section day after day are personal profiles, where it is calculated how many hours you worked on this or that project, or that you stayed up till 3 in the morning and got up at 6 in the morning. That is nonsense. That's not the way a government should be run. Also, we have personalities now in the White House. In our era, back in the Kennedy-Johnson White House, you didn't have quite as many people who spoke on behalf of the president. It was the press secretary. Now you can pick up Johnny Apple's newspaper and you can see 6 or 7 people quoted by name on individual stories who are White House aides with their personal opinion. We elect one president. It shouldn't be Tower of Babel in the White House. It should not be a personality parade. It should not be a judgment based on how, quote-unquote, number of hours you work or, quote-unquote, how hard you work. We ought to be judging people on the substance and the content of what they produce, what their programs are. We see very, very little of that today.
Johnny Apple said a moment ago that it has not gotten tougher than it was back in the Kennedy-Johnson days. Do you disagree with that?
Well, I think I'm not in government now, so I can't make a judgment about whether it is tougher. I do think that this president has set a bad standard for his people. He started out by staying up late and getting up early and making that a badge of courage. He should see to it that his own people spend more time with their families and spend times not just at working dinners, but being with other people because they enjoy being with those people, more about the balance of life. The life that we all lead is far more important than the government that he heads. And the government that he heads isn't going to be worth a damn if the people who are in that government don't get a standard from the top. And that standard isn't coming from him. I support him. I hope he does well, but he needs to set a standard himself. I'll give you one example. When I was Secretary of the Army, I made the mistake of coming into the Pentagon early in the beginning on Saturday mornings and found out that thousands of people were also coming in then. So I stopped doing it. I thought it was more important that they see their families, and I found out that the product, their work, was a heck of a lot better as a result of some balance in their lives. We need some balance in our lives. We need less about the individuals and their personalities. We need less about their loves and devotions and their favorite movie and the last book they read. We need less of whether, someone who speaks on behalf of Ralph Nader thinks that they should be able to get a job after 5 years if they don't do this or that or the other, and more love, trust, and devotion and humanness, which is not what we have today.
Marlin Fitzwater, one of the factors in this, all the commentaries say, and so did Mr. Foster's note, was some of the press coverage, press criticism of his, particularly in the Wall Street Journal. Has that part of the Washington culture, the press coverage, turned nastier in recent years, in your view?
Well, I don't think it's turned any nastier, really. Sometimes it's personal, and when it is, it's difficult. I mean, I was often criticized, and you just have to let those things roll off your back. But that's always been the case. I mean, you can go back to Thomas Nast's drawings and cartoons of the 18th century, and personal journalism has been a staple of our country for many years. So I don't think that can really be cited as a factor in this kind of a behavior.
Johnny Apple, is there merit in Foster's claim, the very poignant last line of the note, here ruining people is considered a sport?
I can't resist, Robin, before answering that question, saying that Fitzwater was one of the 2 or 3 most popular press secretaries in Washington since the war, and he didn't have a lot to roll off his shoulders. Nor, I must say, did Mr. Foster. There were several editorials in the Wall Street Journal, yes, but beyond that, I did a nexus check this afternoon, and he had been mentioned exactly 21 times in major American newspapers, in none of which he was the principal subject since he arrived in Washington on January 20th. He was taken to task by the Wall Street Journal, yes, but it was an isolated example. Now, is it a sport to ruin people? Well, it is certainly not one for which I give licenses in my office, and I hope it's not other places. It is certainly true that we try to find out whether there are holes in official stories. We certainly want to know why there were no fingerprints on this note that was torn up. But that isn't because we're evil wretches. That is because that's our job. And it is our job all the more, I would submit, in an era when government has been notably untruthful, beginning with the Gulf of Tonkin, continuing through Watergate, and a number of more recent episodes.
Clifford Alexander, what is your observation on here ruining people is considered a sport?
I think it is.
Is that paranoia on his part, or is there substance to that?
there is substance to the fact that we're very personal in our observations, we're very personal in our coverage, and I think that it is clearly the right under the First Amendment of any newspaper to say whatever it wants and get away with it, or a television station to make any point it wants. I think the greater point becomes those who have the privilege, as we like to call it, of being in the public sector need to behave more like human beings and less like titular heads of government who stand up before us and show us how good they are. They are indeed human beings that ought to go home. I will enjoy tonight going home and seeing my daughter Elizabeth, who's a poet, and my wife Adele. And if my son were here, Mark, I'd love to see him too. That is far more important than all the nonsense that I did in the White House those many, many years ago. The stuff in the White House is extraordinarily important. It is always done better if there is some balance in your life. What has been taken out of life in the White House is balance. I would dare say that the people in this White House don't even get together with one another. And that's one thing we used to do in the Johnson-Kennedy years. We didn't have any money, and we'd go to each other's houses and we'd have a good time and enjoy one another's company. Sometimes we would have press people there and we'd be probably less cautious than we should have been, but it was enjoyable. You were also doing business once in a while. Now, today I get a sense that when people dine together, they might as well be sitting in their offices and talking to each other about the latest topic. It goes from A to B to C, and that's about it. And that
I'll
is,
tell my
again,
wife that you're complaining about her dinner.
I did not. No. I don't nothing about her ever, but good things. But the point, I think, is that in Washington today, it is more about people than about the content of what the government is bringing to us. More about people than the interaction between press and the government. I don't think it's a challenge round between press.
I just want to, excuse me, I'll come back to you, gentlemen. I just want to turn for a few minutes to Dr. Goodwin here, who's the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. How do you see the pressures they are describing acting on a depressed personality?
Well, I think Mr. Apple made an important point that depression is a highly personal disease. It's an illness. It has some biological vulnerability, but it usually has to be activated by stress. But the stress can be nonspecific. There's no single stress. Usually it relates to people feeling in a helpless situation where there's something that they can't fix and they feel chronically helpless about it. There's usually some loss. Often there's a move involved. There's sometimes what's called a promotion paradox, where people go to a higher position and a lot of the things that they're used to, a lot of the ways they're used to getting their self-esteem is kind of not there anymore. But it's highly individual. All we know about depression is that it's a very common disorder, is about 11 million Americans. It's very treatable, but only 1 out of 3 get treatment because we tend to think we should fix it ourselves. We tend to think we should just, particularly men, think, a stiff upper lip. And it often happens in people who are highly productive, very sensitive, highly valued by their colleagues. And that's the tragedy, that sometimes it can end in death.
The president and others said they didn't know that Foster was so deeply troubled. Can people as close not see signs of depression as serious as this?
Well, I think often the people in the family are the first to notice it because you have symptoms of having trouble staying asleep. You might lose your appetite, lose your interest in pleasure, and so forth. But in a very high-pressure work environment, that's where the most difficulty to see it. For one thing, if a person is very important to everyone around him, then people would have a wish, in a sense, an understandable wish not to see it, but also just the high pressure. And remember, a very highly functional person can be at half-mast, can essentially be functioning at half their capacity and still look good. And there's subtle things like maybe a little less, sort of a flatness, a person who maybe has a stiff laugh all the time rather than the variation in their voice, a person who perhaps is not quite as quick on the uptake, a person who seems thinking a little more slowly. Maybe they pick up a story in the paper that's kind of depressing or about someone else's suicide. There was another one in Washington before that. Ask questions about that. There's subtle signs, but people shouldn't feel bad for having missed it because it happens all the time. But it is a chance to educate people.
Could a depression like this one have been born in 6 months of high-pressure work, or must it have had older origins?
Well, I think we're talking about two things. One is the vulnerability that's there in some people. About 5% of the population has a vulnerability to get clinically depressed, and it's twice as likely in women than it is in men. So women have about a 1 in 7 chance of having this at some time in their life. Men have about a 1 in 14 chance of having it at some time in their life. But you have this vulnerability, then it often is a trigger. You know, it's like if you have high blood pressure. People who have high blood pressure are born with some vulnerability to it. But if you're in a high-pressure situation, you're more likely to have that vulnerability come out and show up as high blood pressure. So it's not either or. It's both the vulnerability, which is partly genetic, and it's also the environment which triggers the vulnerability.
You mentioned the stiff upper lip syndrome. Is depressive illness, does it still carry such a stigma that it inhibits people like high-functioning people like Foster from seeking help? I mean, he got his doctor over the phone in Little Rock to send him by mail some antidepressant medication.
Well, it still has a lot of stigma. As I said, only 1 out of 3 people seek treatment. However, just in the last year, a lot of people have gone public with their history of depression, ranging from Mike Wallace to Ted Turner to Dick Cavett, even to Senator Childs, Governor Childs of Florida. And people coming out like that, I think, who are image-conscious people and have to be, tells us that stigma is shifting, but it's still there.
Let's turn back to the case. Johnny Apple, your own column today says the White House explanations yesterday and the Justice Department explanations leave questions unanswered. What are the most important of them, in your view, that are not answered?
Well, my colleague Bill Sapphire has written a column tomorrow that consists entirely of questions. It is just a string of questions that seem to him to be unanswered. I don't know that I'm quite in that posture, but here are a few. We're told there were no fingerprints on the note. How do you tear up a note and not leave any fingerprints? We know that there's a piece of the note missing. They reassembled the 27 pieces and took a photocopy of it, and the place where a signature would be is covered by a triangular blank. We have never had any explanation of who the person was, except that he was a man in a white van who discovered Vince Foster's body on the far side of the Potomac River. These and other questions do not necessarily, indeed probably do not, point to any plot or any hanky-panky on the part of the White House or the Park Police or anyone else. But the best procedure, in my view, at moments like this, is to have a full explanation and not have it trickle out day after day. We began, after all, with the president and with his aides saying there would never be any answer as to why Vince Foster killed himself, if indeed he did kill himself, because nobody had noticed anything. Then we found out about notes in his pocket. Then we found out about the medication. Then several White House people came forward and said, yes, his wife had noticed some problems and had urged him to write the problems down on a piece of paper. But they had gone away to the shore to talk about it, try to get at the root of it. One thing after another has come out to change this. Now, obviously, part of this is because at a moment of crisis like this, things are disorganized. Mm-hmm. Yesterday, we had an interview with the head of the Park Police who told us that the White House counsel removed a box before the office was sealed and didn't bring it back until the next morning. Mr. Nussbaum, the counsel in question, says that isn't true. We then called back the Park Police people and they said, well, we may have the details, a few of the details wrong, but he did take a box. Then an hour later they called back and said he didn't.
Let me ask Marlon Fitzwater, how important are these questions in your mind?
Well, I think they're all ones that need to be answered. And whenever you're faced with a situation like this in the White House, it's important to tie up the loose ends and preferably to get someone outside the White House to do it for you. And I'm hopeful that they're able to get the Justice Department to give full answers to all these questions. I think it would make everybody feel a lot better. It would help the White House staff, and it would help the American people.
And the man's family, for that matter.
And the family.
Do you have an observation on that, Clifford Alexander?
Yeah, I'd much rather have the president in the White House discussing General Mundy's call for the elimination of married recruits into the Marines. That's absurd in my view, but it requires public discussion. It seems to me that these issues, if they need to be investigated, then they should be by the appropriate authorities. I think they do need that investigation. Whether they need any more newsprint is up to newspapers. I would spend much more time, however, on public issues of great note. There is a little bit of gotcha in this, and it would seem to me that the public issues, and Johnny spends a whole lot of time on public issues, so this is not directed at him, but we need to have far more time on that. That would seem to me to be something to talk about for a half hour on this show and for a lot of other time.
Let me just conclude by asking Dr. Goodwin briefly, is this case, does it have any useful lessons that might help other people
I think
in Washington or elsewhere?
To me, the most enduring public issue here is to educate the public about depression and about suicide. Educate the public that it is a tragedy because these are very treatable disorders. 70% of people will benefit within the first medication treatment. For the more severely depressed, medication is pretty much indicated. But psychotherapy for the less severe cases is also helpful, often combinations of the two. So the tragedy of suicide is that it didn't have to happen. People can learn what to do. People are afraid to use the D word. If you see somebody who seems depressed, say, are you depressed? Don't be afraid. Don't even be afraid to ask about suicide.
Have to leave it there. Dr. Goodman, gentlemen in Washington, thank you.
We close tonight with an essay about passion by the Washington writer Phyllis Thoreau.
Not long ago, I met a man who loves cactus. I found this odd. I have always taken cactus seriously in order not to bump into one. But loving cactus was another story, one I decided to investigate. Rural Virginia is not exactly cactus country, but Darrell Bickle, a professional photographer, has carved out a little bit of Mexico in his backyard, which now has over 900 different kinds of cactus in the ground or greenhouse. Someday, Bickle hopes to put his cactus pictures in a coffee table-sized book, not just for the cactus cognoscenti, and it turns out that the world is full of them, but for people who've often wondered why the Creator found it necessary to make a place for cactus at all, much less for over 3,500 different varieties. Bickle's photos answered this question and raised another. How could I have been so prejudiced as to think that these astonishing bursts of intelligence and poetry, these marooned seascapes, these elaborate molecular designs were ugly? The answer is twofold. Prejudice needs an unhealthy distance from its object in order to operate, and even if we are physically quite close to something, it's still possible to misjudge its worth. The late great art critic Bernard Berenson was once asked how he could tell the difference between a fake and a real masterpiece. He replied, "You must look and look until you are blind with looking, and out of blindness comes illumination." Therein lies the difference between Darrell Bickle and the rest of us. He has kept his eyes steadily trained upon one thing. "No man is quite sane," said Ralph Waldo Emerson. "Each has a vein of folly in his composition, a slight determination of blood to the head to make sure of holding him to some one point which nature has taken to heart." Darrell Bickle's point is cactus. It has become an organizing principle, a way of gathering up random impulses and channeling them in a productive direction. But obviously the world is full of others, some small enough to qualify almost as hobbies, others so large in the person's life that to speak of one is to speak of the other. And the largest passions affect us all. Jonathan Sabin's passion for polio vaccine, pediatrician P. Barry Brazelton's passion for children, civil rights advocate Morris Dee's passion for promoting tolerance, the exiled Dalai Lama of Tibet's passion for peace. And then there is writer Nicholas Gage's immigrant father, Christos, whose wife Eleni was murdered by Greek partisans, leaving him with 5 frightened children to raise in a strange new land. In his memoir, A Place for Us, Gage writes about his father dancing at a family party. When the music began, he led the first dance, moving, as always, with a careful, stately step as he balanced a glass of wine on his bald pate. That image of Gage's elderly father balancing his burden and his wine in a dance of controlled exuberance comes closest to the essence of the grandest passion of them all, for life. And thanks to Nicholas Gage's passion for words, his father still dances for everybody. True passion tends to be generous. I'm Phyllis Thoreau.
Again, the major stories of this Wednesday. President Clinton has nominated Army General John Shalikashvili as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He would replace Colin Powell, who retires in September. On the NewsHour tonight, Secretary of State Christopher said NATO airstrikes on Serbian positions in Bosnia will begin very quickly if the Serbs do not voluntarily end their stranglehold on Sarajevo. But he said the U.S. and its allies have set no deadline for the withdrawal. Good night, Robin.
Good night, Roger. That's the NewsHour tonight, and we'll see you again tomorrow night. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
Major funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by PepsiCo. PepsiCo. And by the Archer Daniels Midland Company. ADM, supermarket to the world. And by New York Life, yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
Funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is provided by the professional contractors of NECA and union craftspeople of IBEW Local 48, providing vision for the future.
And by Kinko's, the Copy Center, offering a wide range of business services 24